Okay.
I'm going to silence my phone and remind everyone else.
Yeah. Zoom, zoom, zoom.
How do you want to deal with the recorded version? I know that can you give it to Ali?
Yeah, I think she could be the gatekeeper. Thank you, Abby.
Where's Lauren?
With my sister.
Hopefully.
No,
Okay.
yeah. I was like, I have to leave by 2, and he was like at 1:59. So peaceful. Like, this never happens. Anyway, I'll let y'all.
That's okay. Just double checking the text stuff.
Oh, nice shirt. Oh,
Wow,
this is a big deal.
that's a big deal. No flip flops. It's perfect flip flop weather. It's
It is.
my personal opinion.
When I first moved to Michigan, July, I wore flip flops until November, until it was like 6 inches
Yeah.
of snow, and then
Yeah.
I finally like,
No.
this is nuts.
I would also, well, yeah. I wore Birkenstocks in the winter in Wisconsin and in Iowa as an undergrad. And like one of my anthropology professors who had been there for a very long time. What are you doing, man? Like that's just ridiculous. Like put on some real shoes.
I was riding my bike through the snow, through this like blizzard in Ann Arbor, and wearing flip flops, and there was a reporter, and I realized he was a reporter later. But anyway, he was like, "Hey, come here!" Like he like took my picture. And, oh, get out of here!
Run him out of town. I also just wanted to note for everyone that this this presentation is being recorded. It won't be distributed, but it is being recorded for Icon archives. Everyone on Zoom see this presentation?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. A few others are trickling in, so we'll just give it a couple more minutes. I think we could probably get started. Okay. I'll let Pete do the honors of the introduction. I'll step to the side here.
Hey everyone, hey Julie. You're still in the same office. Hi Sienna, you're there, and Bob. David needs no introduction, but as is our custom, I will introduce him. David joined the ICON program in 2015. I think that was the fourth cohort, something like that. He, prior to coming to UGA, he had worked in conservation, mostly in conservation for a number of years. He'd already also spent time in Bhutan working on conservation issues with the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature in Bhutan, which we'll be hearing about today. In 2014, he was in Bhutan when the Society for Ethnobiology meetings were held there, and Julie attended, and Chris Joseph, and I believe some other UGA people, and they met David and told him about the ICON program, and he thought, that sounds cool. And here we are today. So he came to UGA and into the ICON program knowing that he wanted to continue this work that he had been doing in Bhutan. Over the intervening years, as he was developing his dissertation proposal and so forth, he was very, very successful with grants, awarded 3 grants from National Geographic, the Geographic Explorer, Young Explorer, and one other, as well as a sizable grant from the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research. Since he's been here at UGA, he's also completed 2 certificate programs in conservation ecology, sustainable development, and nonprofit management and leadership. He's been very, very prolific with respect to numerous aspects of strategic communication, which is one of the requirements in ICON, with all kinds of public webinars and video interviews, etc. And also doing quite a bit of, in addition to his academic writing, some popular writing in journals like Current Conservation. He's continued his engagements with the Society for Ethnobiology. He was a board member representing North America for 3 years, and is also an organizing member of the Society's Addressing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Ethnobiology committee. As you'll see from his presentation, his work, I think, stands as a real exemplar of how both we do ethnographic research collaboratively, but also it's a great exemplar of integrative conservation research in the spirit of ICON. Before we proceed, I just want to let you know how it's going to go. David will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, the floor is open for those either online or in the room to ask questions. I guess you can monitor the screen to see if anyone raises a virtual hand. I would ask that the committee refrain from asking questions during that period. We want to let people who are here ask their questions, and then at about 4 o'clock, we'll ask everyone to excuse themselves, and then we'll go into the defense. So this, as David mentioned, this will be recorded. And also, if you are interested, we'll be at Little King's afterwards, either having a beer or chamomile, depending on how the defense goes. So, all right.
Okay,
David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pete, and good afternoon, all. It is an honor to be here with you today to discuss the culmination of what for me has been a really fascinating journey into deeper understandings of the world's many cultural, ecological, and political complexities of conservation. Let me just briefly address my choice of attire, because people here may be curious. And though it may seem unusual in this context, I wish to be attentive to my audience. So not just to those of you here in this room or joining virtually from the US or elsewhere, but to my colleagues and dearest friends in Bhutan, without whom this research would not be possible. And within Driglam Namza, which is the official code of etiquette in Bhutan, it is expected that everyone come in traditional dress. So go for men, kira for women, and particularly for meetings and formal events. And I would consider this to be a formal event. So it was expected of me there, and I'm wearing it deferentially as it is expected of me today. So to all my relations near and far, thank you for accompanying me, enlightening me, humbling me, supporting me, and guiding me. I wouldn't be here without all of the support of my friends and family here and in Bhutan and around the world. And I am very gratified to have the opportunity to share more about our research in my dissertation. Let me just first extend my gratitude to my committee for their invaluable guidance, to my research collaborators, particularly Jigmeet Siring, Indra Acharya, and Gyempo Wangchuk. Let me also thank my institutional collaborators at the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature and the funding agencies that are supported and are supporting this work, namely the National Geographic Society and the Firebird Foundation for Anthropological Research. While I started my graduate studies in 2015, pre-dissertation research began in 2016 and 2017 with my ICON internship with the Nature Conservancy's Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Global Program in the summer of 2018. Today, I will be sequentially discussing the chapters of my dissertation with particular attention to the progression of our research findings and the resulting pivot in our methodologies due to circumstances and my own evolving thinking. In doing so, I wish to provide just one example of how more than human agencies in non-Western landscape ontologies, spatialities, relationalities, and territorialities can be centered and contributive to more inclusive and representative ways of thinking about environmental protection and conservation in our modern world, building on decades of participatory and collaborative scholarship at these intersections. So in the introduction chapter, let me just begin by articulating an important backdrop to our research so that the theoretical underpinnings and methodological choices of the study can be appropriately contextualized and supported. Though there are many religious expressions in Bhutan, this dissertation focuses at the intersections of Vajrayana Buddhism and indigenous Bon animism in the Eastern Himalayas, recognizing that complex relational and spatial ontologies exist between protective territorial deities, namely Yula, Jida, often communally termed Neda Jida, and the communities that propitiate them. In Bhutan, a suite of local deities and more than human spirits are known to occupy territory within the landscape and are often agents of change and power in mountains, forests, cliffs, lakes, springs, and frequently old growth trees, such as the giant cypress tree you see here. This is the principal abode of a local deity. Different local deity classes occupy and exhibit agency and tenurial power in encompassing territories or habitats described as the deity's palace or citadel of the deity, or podram in Dzongkha, wherein specific social and communal rules govern entry, extraction, and development activities within the deity's territory to maintain good community relations. These more than human worlds inevitably intersect with the political ecologies of the human and non-human wildlife worlds, as well as the ontologies of environmental conservation and development in the kingdom. In order to address the many complexities at play therein, this research is preceded by a theoretical review in chapter 1 that is situated at the intersection of three important bodies of literature: conservation science and the politics of knowledge, critical geography and the politics of scale, and landscape ontologies and the politics of agency, namely more than human agencies. The components of our theoretical framework are not discrete unto themselves, hence the Venn diagram, but are intersecting sets of theoretical entry points and thematic underpinnings. And as much as they describe the framework, they also describe our epistemic blinders and the embedded biases that ultimately generated certain ontological frictions, which we shine a light on and attempt to address within and beyond the dissertation. While imperfectly termed, they represent our attempt at integrative thinking, drawing on disciplinary lenses adopted from conservation ecology, human geography, and cultural anthropology. And while there are 1,000 things to say at these intersections and brilliant scholarship to foreground, our time today only allows a quick summary of how I contend with them in this framework. In the first theoretical review, Conservation Science and the Politics of Knowledge, I explore literature that helps me contend with questions such as whose knowledge counts, whose ways of knowing and being in the world are privileged or marginalized, empowered or disempowered, and are some forms of knowledge, ways of knowing and being in the world, incommensurate, that is, unable to be measured by the same metrics. The second theoretical review, I explore literature that helps me to contend with questions such as What relational forces or power dynamics are made legible or illegible at various geographic scales? And who gets to determine the unit of analysis and scope of cartographic legibility vis-a-vis the map? In the third theoretical review, guided by more than humanist theory, I explore literature that helps me to contend with questions such as which agents in our study system are deemed capable of acting, being an agent of change in the world, empowered or disempowered to act, inclusive of both tangible and intangible beings, humans such as community research participants, non-human wildlife such as black-necked cranes, and more than human beings, including local deities and spirits who also occupy space in the landscape. How then can more pluralistic understandings of the surrounding landscapes and communities of actors within them contribute to spatial and relational thinking that is more inclusive of these worlds of our research participants? With these theoretical underpinnings in mind, let's move to chapter 2 to discuss our research design, research questions, and the methodologies used to approach these questions. My institutional collaborators and I were intentional and dedicated to co-designing research that aligned with RSPN's long-term community-based conservation initiatives for the globally threatened black-necked cranes in the high-altitude wetland communities of Wangdu Podrang, Bhutan, Lunsi, and Tashi-Yangtze, and as well as critically endangered white-bellied herons within the kingdom's major river systems in Punakha and Sirang. The goal of our research has been and continues to be to collaborate with community partners in Bhutan's conservation protected areas for these focal species to better understand how communities perceive their own local environments and shared landscapes and the diversity of actors within them. Many of the research questions I had in this context were relational and spatial questions, which I will summarize here. The first question being, what are some of the historical and contemporary forces that influence crane and heron conservation in Bhutan? The second question generally asks, how did people navigate between the non-human worlds of wildlife and the more than human worlds of deities and spirits to understand different ideas of conservation and protected areas and protected space? And then the third question basically asks, how did the technologies we use to map those places condition how we see them, and thus how we protect them, and whose worlds are included or not? We use different methods to address these research questions, and we address them each successively in preceding data chapters. So question 1 was broadly addressed in chapter 3, question 2 in chapter 4, and so forth. Around 374 individuals participated in our research. Here's a basic breakdown of our research participants, segregated by method, not including, of course, all of the unstructured dialogues within the context of simply being with people at work and in community. Now, of course, it's important to note that there are varying levels and degrees of participatory depth. Our research approach fell within the following range between consultation, cooperation, and co-learning, ideally, right? Constrained by numerous institutional, temporal, and financial factors, as well as certain phenomena that were completely out of our control, such as a global pandemic, which significantly hampered our momentum during the final phases of community data validation. And while we used a variety of methods, as you see here, participatory mapping addressed these political, ecological, spatial, and ontological complexities in most illuminating ways. Broadly defined, participatory mapping is used to represent the spatial knowledge of local communities, and it can take many different forms, considering the decades of scholarship and applied work in conservation and development sectors that use this method. Our research prioritized the following submethods: sketch mapping and scale mapping through collaborative mapping, counter mapping, and web mapping applications. From these methods, the primary form of data in our research was qualitative data, frequently linked with spatial reference data in the form of community-generated coded data maps and free-form sketch maps. Once audio and video data were transcribed, initial themes were recorded and collated by relevance and subject. They were thematically coded and reviewed by hand through grounded theory analysis to investigate patterns in conversations and trends across sites. This spatially linked qualitative data were iteratively, and as I said, manually annualized once validated during community consultations to elucidate common themes, relationships, and patterns amongst the data. And while open source geographic information systems, or GIS, proved to be valuable tools during our data analysis, open source software such as QGIS and Google Earth, towards particular analytical ends, the ontological constraints of the software became a mode of reflexive inquiry rather than a central methodological tool for geospatial analysis. So emergent patterns within transcripts informed future thematic analysis and contributed towards the collection of follow-up inquiries with research informants. Particular attention was given to code shifting, similarity, sequence, and participatory politics, with the overall aim to develop more complete understandings of the spectrum of diverse views of individuals in a group and varying worlds amongst and between research participants. Here is a general timeline of the research implementation. And while COVID-19 significantly disrupted our final phases of data collection and validation due to a series of national lockdowns, we were able to productively pivot our research design and objectives to accommodate other fruitful collaborations that are the subject of Chapter 5, which includes a non-traditional thesis element. So let's start with Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a co-authored chapter with Mr. Indra Acharya, and as such, the future article employs some strategic positivism to ensure that joint publishing has scientific and academic currency for both authors. It also means the chapter has a more concise scope than our archive of qualitative data would otherwise support, but we are hoping to publish more extensively together on some of the complexities at a later date. So this first of 3 data chapters begins chronologically with some of the earliest research phases, focusing engagement with community partners involved in long-term efforts to monitor and safeguard habitat for the critically endangered white-bellied heron, which you see here. This chapter inquires more deeply into the regional, geopolitical, and sociocultural forces and entanglements that influence conservation initiatives for this focal species at institutional and local scales, and explores the complexities of relationships across human, non-human, and more than human actor groups within the process. Importantly, in this context, I should note that the white-bellied heron is a critically endangered species with fewer than 60 known individuals left in the world. Most individuals and nesting pairs reside in Bhutan along 2 major river systems. We were lucky enough during population surveys in 2019 to capture the following photo of a nesting pair, which is an extremely rare occurrence. As a species with extremely low population, any threat to individuals or nesting pairs through human development, encroachment, or competition is highly significant. And part of our team efforts were to draw on local knowledge and expertise to explore those threat matrices and collectively find strategies together to mitigate them. Certain geopolitical forces influencing the construction of hydroelectrical dams on these 2 major river systems are also highly significant in these areas and interface in intricate ways with future efforts to safeguard habitat for this species. In our work, we aim to prioritize the voices and perspectives of local community partners who have been involved in these efforts, some for nearly 3 decades. Our study site selection was thus non-random, corresponding to communities adjacent to active nesting areas for the species in the kingdom. Now, one of RSPN's long-term strategies within this project has been the establishment of the Local Conservation Support Group Network, a subset of which you see here. This is a collaborative alliance of local stakeholders charged with monitoring this species and fostering community stewardship within its domestic home range. The emergence and engagement of this community-based group not only marks a demonstrable shift in sociocultural value systems and participatory politics, but also alludes to the capacity of communities to collaborate across scales and knowledges, generate local benefits via sustainable livelihood endeavors, and co-create stewardship norms for a threatened species. In our research, we employed semi-structured interviews, recurrent participatory mapping, and focus group discussions to explore the spatial and relational aspects of white-bellied heron conservation in these areas. To better understand emerging threats, observations of environmental and social change, as well as opportunities to protect heron habitat, feeding resources, and engage local communities through sustainable development programs. In this chapter, we argue that this level of participatory science fosters opportunities for field partners to contribute empirical data to advance scientific knowledge of endangered species and their habitats, despite complex social histories and geopolitics. In our own work, we expanded on this premise by asking local partners to participate in a 6-phase participatory mapping series to explore histories of development pressures on river ecosystems, local perceptions of social and environmental change, and community investment in conservation efforts, in addition to white-bellied heron nest site observations, behavioral ecology, and observed or potential threats. While interviews and community ethnography provided depth to these dynamics, participatory mapping proved to be a particularly valuable method for situating local knowledge within the landscape through time, memory, lived experience, and local expertise. Here you see a few color-coded tags that were used to mark significant sites and toponyms in orange, notable environmental changes over time in green, and perceived threats to heron habitat, foraging sites, or nesting sites in pink. This was also true of sketch mapping protocols, which helped identify fine-scale knowledge and perceptions of environmental change alongside human and non-human actors within the landscape, allowing participants to dictate their own spatial and relational priorities. In this particular subset, numerous participants drew high-capacity electrical lines as part of the landscape that were recently constructed to export hydropower energy directly to India, identifying built infrastructure as part of an emerging threat matrix to herons. Sketch mapping protocols also, interestingly, illuminated more than human actors, so local deities and spirits such as Bhutan, who are local protector goddesses in the Lodsampa Hindu tradition that also reside in the landscape, frequently linked to water sources. The cutting of trees or polluting these territories or areas can cause sickness in the family or spark natural disasters. Bhutan are also known to shift in response to human encroachment and development such as roads, particularly if freshwater sources are disturbed. Water sources. Due to certain constraints and politics within our work failed to privilege these particular worlds, though they informed our multi-sided research design. So other more than human relationalities and agencies were illuminated in our participatory mapping series alongside instances of threats to herons in pink, environmental changes in green, such as the changing fish populations that were noted, changing river turbidity and clarity downstream of hydropower infrastructure. In some of our field sites and with partnering communities, new coded tags in yellow were integrated when local partners put local deities and more than human spirits on the map, interlinking particular community ecologies. So in sites where religious practices are aligned with pre-Buddhist Bon religious practices in Vajrayana Buddhist orthodoxy, local deities such as Yula, Jida, Tsen, presiding over mountains and cliffsides and forest patches. One participant reflects that small, less powerful village local deities are nearby, but that large ones are very far away. So in this particular quote that you see here, this is sort of an example of what can happen when extreme types of retribution occur when deities' territories are not respected. This individual says that if these deities' trees are cut down, Neishing, if we cut down, then soon we will fulfill Buddha's heaven. So essentially death. And there were so many other instances of these kinds of reflections that were really interesting. For example, we also asked another participant if local deities or spirits impacted or interfaced with heron habitats, for example. And the answer was frankly stated that herons can't prey and are thus spared from benevolent or malevolent retribution, of course. So in this chapter, we suggest that involving community members as part of a local conservation support group network in Bhutan goes beyond the participation and engagement frequently found in community-based conservation programs and demonstrates how community partners are contributing empirical data to scientific studies of priority species. The outcome of these engagements illuminate the socio-cultural and political complexities in which heron conservation takes place and the value of ensuring community participation for understanding these different realities occurs. Moreover, acknowledgement of community contributions to conservation efforts and the integration of local knowledge with population demography studies has proved essential in making effective conservation decision-making strategies for this species and for others. A guiding objective of this research was to foreground local knowledge of herons and conservation efforts. Additionally, it aims to recontextualize the enactment of species-focused conservation legacies and activities as intrinsically complex, multi-scalar, and enhanced by embracing knowledge pluralism. Towards this end, we point to local knowledges in these geographical contexts that have bearing on environmental management decisions and landscape scale governance, including the unseen more than human world of local deities such as Jida and spirits such as Debitan in the Lotsampo world, revealed in our mapping exercises. These critical insights led to expanding inquiries into the more than human world and an extension of our research field site purview by including other sites of conservation intervention, namely for the highly revered blackneck cranes, to illuminate other value matrices, which I will elaborate on now in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is entitled More Than Human Landscapes, Mapping Protected Species and Protective Deities in Sites of Conservation in Bhutan. And this is where, in this chapter, we begin to explore the complexities of participatory mapping and the political ecologies that emerge during the process in association with the many actors that wield agency in these sites. While community relationships with white-bellied herons, for example, are historically marked by a certain degree of ambivalence due to the obscurity and sort of the cryptic nature of herons. There's so few of them. Whereas community associations with blackneck cranes are comparatively reverent, as many consider blackneck cranes to be heavenly birds, reincarnated bodhisattvas or spiritual teachers. So we expanded our study sites in early 2017 to correspond to these protected high altitude wetland complexes that are habitats for wintering blackneck cranes in Bhutan. And as you can see, our study site selection was also non-random, corresponding to the roosting sites and communities for blackneck cranes. Drawing from our insights in southern Bhutan, we engaged in participatory mapping protocols with partnering communities in these valleys to better understand local perceptions of environmental governance politics for cranes, alongside knowledge of important community ecologies and development pressures. And the more we ask community partners to detail those important relationships and agents of environmental change or authority within these conservation landscapes on the map, the more the map changed, because stories emerged of powerful yet intangible deities and spirits that also occupy space. The collaborative and participatory nature of our research prioritized these local voices, not as natural or cultural resources to be managed, as it is so often framed in conservation and development discourse, but as lived relational interdependencies of our more than human world. Our sketch mapping methodologies expanded as well. A group of local government officials drew this particular map together in the site of the largest population of wintering blackneck cranes, which is also a conservation protected area and Ramsar site. They drew significant buildings like hospitals, temples, and schools, and important landscape features like the surrounding hillsides, central river, and wetland network. And if you zoomed into this particular map at the top, you would see the names of local deities written on the mountainsides, Yulajida, Nedajida, whose hillside territories are Pudrong. Often dense old growth forests surround these wetland complexes. Just like humans' relationships with wildlife and other non-human beings, community relationships with local deities need to be cultivated, tended, and cared for through annual rituals and ceremonies, as well as the enforcement of rules, such as not cutting down trees within the deity's podrong or entering during the wrong time of year. Already, myself, I was starting to see what is self-evident to many of our research partners: the importance of this old growth forest network, the surrounding hillside palaces or citadels of local deities, for the well-being of the settlements and villages along the valley floor, nestled within a crucial watershed and wetland complexes, both for humans and non-human wildlife like cranes. The term Yula itself means the deity of the place or settlement. And though intangible and invisible, Yula are just as much a part of the community as any tangible visible being, and thus they're put on the map. We use sketch mapping methods frequently, and they illuminated diverse local perspectives, relationships, and ecologies between communities and myriad local deity classes. These sketch maps highlighted the ubiquity of local deities and spirits throughout Bhutan. In just these few sketch maps are Yula, Jida, Nepo, Gelpo, Lu, Tsen, Pola, Mola, and other deity and more than human spirit types. This is one reason why our participatory mapping methodologies were valuable in this context, as they were intentionally free-form and more self-directive than other methods. As I gave research partners a blank sheet of paper with the open-ended prompt to draw your community and the places and relationships within them that are important to you. So this first video, one participant describes the subterranean spirits, or Lu, that reside near every household. So in the second video, the participant describes a Tsen on the cliffside. He says, "Chegi Tsen," which means our Tsen, our local deity. So while sketch mapping protocols were valuable, they were also highly individualistic. We employed participatory methodologies that benefited group conversations as well, using a printed orthographic scale map to detail and discuss important places and relationships within landscapes that are sites of long-term conservation initiatives for black-necked cranes. This was very valuable for understanding the territorial and spatial nature of the intangible beings that also occupy space in these areas, and their proximity and relationality with other humans and non-human actors in conservation protected areas, allowing community members to discuss with one another their shared experiences and knowledge. These sessions, alongside semi-structured interviews, illuminated important details about the interface between local deities and the environment, and illuminated some of the ways in which deity relationships are navigated. So essentially in that first recording, an individual is talking about preserving the bow of Agedela, which means ensuring that his principal abode, a tree, and Podrang, which is the hillside of old growth trees, are also preserved and protected. And the second quote you see here illuminates this connection between pre-Buddhist deities that were historically fortified by Vajrayana Buddhism, because one of the great masters, being Guru Rinpoche, who's considered to be the second Buddha, is known to have subdued many of the unruly local deities and spirits that were inflicting chaos in the world. And he charged them to be propitiants of the Dharma. Some local deity classes like Dud, for example, are still considered quite dangerous and difficult, but very important to appease. What we found during this process was that it also encouraged cross-generational conversations. And that's really important in this context because our research suggests that much of this knowledge is very infrequently passed down to the next generation. The process of mapping was oftentimes more illuminating than the end product because the negotiations that occurred in consultation across generations, genders, and occupations illuminated rich oral histories, complex power dynamics, more than human agencies in many worlds within worlds. The conversations that emerged because of the map that were in the middle of our circle were sometimes the most enlightening because it prompted discussion and storytelling between participants. Just as a quick summary of this particular reflection, this individual talked about how Yula Jida, Neda Jida, who are in the forests, there are tensions with development agencies that also are using those trees or looking for those trees as sort of natural resources to use. He was saying that even Lu Sadak are extracted from their original place and shifted to new areas by machines. It's harming both the owner as well as the machine driver himself. And he goes on to reflect on a story where this happened to a machine driver, and the Lu was upset, and as a consequence, both of his legs became paralyzed, and he had to go back and create some ritual propitiations for that deity. So these maps were invaluable for understanding deity territoriality and the relational ontologies within these landscapes. You see here participants indicating the abode of local deities, as well as sort of gesturing to the extent of their tenurial power and extent of their territory. So while these data maps illuminated sometimes overlooked worldviews and perspectives of local community members involved in community-based conservation programs, they remained flat, printed two-dimensional base maps that were in some ways reflections of my own perceptions of what constitutes a valid representation of a landscape. Bringing them into my computer, they became inanimate, coded data points that could be georeferenced as points, pixels, and polygons in a GIS, yet orange tags for place names, yellow tags for local deities and non-human spirits. And though valuable cultural heritage archives, these maps, like all maps, were unrepresentative of the lived phenomenological worlds of our research partners and the unseen beings that wield influence across the landscape. Or more importantly, they fail to adequately represent the nature of deity, territoriality, and spatiality, complicating the notions of boundaries and borders frequently wielded in conservation GIS, as deity territorial thresholds are inherently fluid and relational, storied and phenomenological, living and animate. And so this chapter utilizes the lens of participatory mapping methodologies and multi-sided ethnography to center local community narratives and perceptive worlds. In addition to foregrounding community-populated maps of local deities, we explore the political ecology of these more than human landscapes and investigate whether the idea of landscape has an analytical purchase in the applied conservation sector and in the daily lives of our local community partners and research participants. While notions of sacred or spiritual landscapes as an interface of conservation utility have grown more ubiquitous in conservation practice, they are frequently engaged with uncritically and fail to capture the complexities of the context-specific relationships within those landscapes. So this chapter acknowledges the inextricable nature of these more than human agencies and politics of scale in the formation of conservation landscape ontologies, particularly at these intersections. And it aims to center local community experiences and worlds in the process of these methodologies. This chapter explores these and you know, though it to adequately capture the spatial worlds relayed by our research participants. Moreover, it delves deeper into whether or not the more than human cosmopolitical ecologies of conservation landscapes are commensurate with Western cartographic traditions and reducible to Euclidean space. Our findings suggest that alternative culturally contextual technologies of visualization, such as religious painting traditions, are perhaps more capable of representing these living worlds, as they already do throughout the Himalayas, prompting a collaborative counter map series that are theoretically and practically explored in chapter 5, which I will end with now. So challenging how these conservation geographies for non-human focal species like cranes and herons and the more than human communities that surround and intersect them are mapped, and indeed the very idea of what could get us closer to centering other cultural worlds in conservation mapmaking, representative of the patchwork of citadels of conservation that long predate modern neoliberal conservation ideals and ethics. What then could maps look like that stretched the built-in Western cartographic rules or assumptions inherent in a satellite or topographic base map to center non-Western landscape ontologies and more than human agencies? And so I wanted to counter these integrated rules of assumptions of Euclidean map in conservation mapping for focal species or otherwise by drawing on the visionary worlds native to Bhutan and the Eastern Himalayas. So that's why I started working with a traditional contemporary artist, Mr. Gyempo Wangchuk, and the partnering communities whose now populated maps we drew on to paint a series of first-person landscape-oriented maps through the traditions of Tanka which are religious scroll art, and debris, which is religious mural paintings, to foreground the worlds of local deities in these communities where they wield environmental agency and power. A corner of one of these maps you see here, with local deities and their citadels represented alongside black-necked cranes migrating from Tibet and into the valleys of Bhutan. One of those valleys is here, a place that I know deeply, having lived here for many months. During our time, I found one of the central ontological constraints of our participatory mapping paradigm, outside of the sketch mapping protocols, were that it didn't create the capacity for Bhutanese views of the landscape to be centered or privileged. After all, communities live in these areas with this view, not looking down from a satellite or a crane's eye view of their home they've known for generations. Moreover, depending on who is looking, this landscape holds different actors and relationships. From my own ignorant vantage point, this is a conservation Ramsar site, the largest wintering grounds for black-necked cranes. It's a collection of timber and non-timber forest products, agricultural fields of turnips. And what this view fails to recognize are the invisible, intangible actors that co-constitute local community ecologies. From the view of one of my longest running community research participants, he sees these things too, but he also knows that the hillside to the right that you see in this picture is the citadel of Yulajida named Age Langlep, or Age means grandfather, so grandfather Langlep, who is the original owner of this place. Here in this painting, which is of the same view with humans and non-human wildlife represented, another essential factor that is not adequately captured by maps with an orthographic view rather than an oblique view is Bhutanese Buddhist cosmology, in which the world has three known parts: the upper realm, La, the middle realm, Sen, and the lower realms, Lu. Each of these has its own distinctive local deity classes and spirits, many of which influence the world of humans. So if these worlds and cosmologies are to be centered and foregrounded in conservation discourse for how landscapes should be seen, perhaps we must consider mapping otherwise. With just a few minutes left, let me explain how we went about creating visualizations that were a bit more representative of this living world. So drawing on these data maps, we found in just one of a dozen partnering communities, participants could have mapped hundreds of local deities and more than human spirits. Some are known by name, others are known only by their podrang or biogeographical markers. The main deities found in almost all community rituals are gestured to here, known to surround the protected wetland complex for black-necked cranes in all 5 directions. Though there is likely not a place on this map that doesn't have a local deity, participants often highlighted the most powerful and significant details found in wider community annual rituals, and they gestured to them here by name, describing their characteristics and their temperament during our mapping series that are indicated here in blue. Also seen surrounding the Central Valley and conservation protected sites, long-term conservation sites of intervention for black-necked cranes as well. So here is a 3D version of that same map, brought into a GIS, limited as it may be, to bring out the topography of an otherwise 2D map. From here, we projected these stories of deities and relational toponyms onto the canvas, drawing from our community ethnographic data, mapping sessions, and consultations with hundreds of Circumpecha ritual texts and Buddhist authorities, creating a painted map that was geographically and topographically accurate down to every river, hillside, old forest patch, and pasture land. So the result being a data map that could be rendered in a GIS that is now made animate as a painted map, informed by Tibetan and Bhutanese technologies of visualization and Vajrayana Buddhism that highlight places of conservation significance alongside local deities and their podrang, illuminating much more complex relational ontologies within these focal landscapes. And I just want to note that there are no arbitrary choices in this visualization or this map. This painting contains within it hours and hours, months and months of Gyempo and myself in the studio, contacting community partners, local experts and religious authorities by WhatsApp occasionally during the pandemic, inviting community knowledge holders to the studio, consulting hundreds of ritual texts, while others are unaccounted for. The most powerful deities here are represented. And this place is particularly important for Gyempo, as it is his childhood home, which he knows intimately. he even decided to draw his own house in the back next to the lake where Tsomen resides, sort of a mermaid, half snake, half human, which also happens to be next to the roosting grounds for black-necked cranes. And if you look closely, if you squint, there are black-necked cranes in their central roosting grounds at the top of the valley there, as well as they are here, migrating from the north across the border and from Tibet. So with the guidance from the Ministry of Home and Cultural Affairs, we are completing a series of 5 paintings corresponding to these conservation protected areas for cranes. And we have already completed 4. The last one we will complete in a valley that's just over the mountain here, in a place whose place name basically translates in Dzongkha as conch. And if you look on far to the left, there's a conch cloud there that indicates that the next map is just over the horizon. So this visualization was just the first one, and it really afforded us the opportunity to share it with our community partners as well as the Central Monastic Authority in Bhutan on my most recent trip back to Bhutan a few weeks ago. And it was very well received, and we were extraordinarily grateful and humbled to be there. So this process, all of this work in what Chapter 5 focuses on, draws on the insights from Chapters 3 and 4 by acknowledging and articulating the knowledge pluralisms and myriad politics of knowledge and scale and agency across our study sites, endeavoring to operationalize an integrative framework for thinking across disciplinary lines. This chapter challenges how landscapes and landforms are frequently mapped and conceptualized for focal species conservation, and problematizes the idea of what a map is by centering other worlds in map making. We ask what maps of the frequently marginalized, more than human worlds of deities and spirits could look like if we choose to stretch those built-in Western cartographic rules or assumptions, particularly in notions of accuracy and scale. The hallmark of this study, of course, was a collaborative pursuit with the co-PI, traditional contemporary artist, Mr. Gyampo Wangchuk, who partnered to produce these series of maps. This chapter is developed on the premise that traditional art forms in the Himalayan worlds have long explored the power of visualization in representing the complexities of the 6 realms of rebirth and existence, and associated with sacred or spiritual landscapes of human inscription, suggesting that the long histories and traditions of manifesting these worlds through religious art can be a conceptual starting point for mapping otherwise, and ensuring that these living traditions are brought into conversation with conservation practitioners, decision makers, and partnering agencies. And so I just want to acknowledge that while Chapter 5 is a written chapter, the work within it extends beyond what text is capable of capturing. And so there's another element to this chapter, wherein we also created a website that shows some of these complexities more fully. We'll find that here. Bear with me here as I figure out the tech. So I just wanted to go through very briefly what this website does and intends to do. Our goal with this is to have sort of a platform, a directory that can provide more background to this project illuminate, of course, the artists who did this work, who are shown here. Here's Mr. Gyampo Wangchuk and Pema Gyaltsen, who is his apprentice. And that's, of course, me. So this website will have some background information about sort of the history of mapping differently and how maps can represent all kinds of worlds and ways of being and knowing in the world. And so there are these backdrops here. I also have sort of more, theoretical backdrops that point to critical geography and participatory politics. There's a section here that goes through the research process that just essentially contextualizes some of these maps more fully. These maps will then be accessible by member access only. So there will be password protected, only accessible to the community members who made it possible. I'm just gesturing to them here in these blurred images. Here's the first map series that we did, the second one, the third, and the fourth. And for those who are interested within the sort of password protected members only group, they will also have the information to the troves of data, the ritual texts that we collected and transcribed, the audio files that, of course, and the video files, but only those in which permission was granted to share and archive those. And then the transcripts and translations for those who are interested. So let me just close this out here. So to conclude, with this project comes 1,000 different choices, hypocrisies and contradictions, issues of ontological fixing in time and space, of more than human beings, institutional power dynamics and knowledge privileging. I nod to a long history of Bhutan scholars navigating these complexities. In our small way, we're asking how mapping otherwise can recenter the possibility of the multiplicity of worlds and the diversity of community environmental relationships within them. We aim to center Bhutanese traditions and worlds of knowing and ask how landscapes are conceptualized and rendered visible, not only through maps, but through traditional art, religious practice, ritual propitiations, and the preservation and use of ritual circium texts that richly depict and in essence, map the relational worlds of local deities and their environmental corollaries. Ultimately, we suggest that the limiting ontologies of Western cartographic traditions, particularly as they exist in the conservation and development sector, are insufficient for respecting and representing the living legacies of Vajrayana Buddhism and the territorial worlds of local deities and spirits that are more relational and fluid than points, polygons, and pixels can possibly depict, prompting alternative methodologies which endeavor to push both disciplinary and epistemic boundaries. And with that, I thank everyone. I thank my advisory committee, my friends, colleagues, collaborators, of course, my family, my wife, who I wouldn't have been able to do this without, my son. And I just want to give one quick message of love to Ashley Block, who was in our cohort as a graduate student and then sadly passed away a number of years ago. So thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. And I'll take any questions that you might have. Graham, go ahead.
I really enjoyed the talk. It strikes me as it's a different kind of story than what we often have as anthropology stories, particularly in conservation, where Bhutan just seems like a really special place, right? The sort of typical story that an anthropologist tells is, I went out and visited a sonic minority in some rural place where it's drastically misunderstood, and here's the way they understand the world compared to some sort of monolithic modern majority machine. And in Bhutan, I think it's like what the exotic is the majority, right?
Yeah.
You don't have that. So I was just wondering how in Bhutan that translates into practice. Cranes and herons are the actual on the ground, is there a modern monolithic machine that is developing and chopping down and clearing that is a threat to push it back against? And secondly, is the fact that the quote unquote exotic is the majority that lead to better outcomes for conservation?
So I'm not sure if others in Zoom could hear. Yeah, okay. So if I can try to summarize Dr. Bram Tucker's question. He asked, sort of with the understanding that in the history and the discipline of anthropology, anthropologists have gone out to sort of, and there's a tradition of sort of explaining the other, right? And sometimes these communities can be rather marginalized and in those contexts, but in Bhutan in particular, I think Bram said like those communities are dominant culture in these areas. And what does that what does that mean for the ways in which local deities or spirits are viewed or not within the landscape? Is there sort of an anti-politics development machine that is out there trying to cut down forests and create unsustainable development? And how does that interface within those worlds? So I would just say that I feel like Bhutan, and I know probably many other countries and contexts, but I'm just speaking from this standpoint, really interestingly has a foot in two worlds. One of those worlds being tradition, history, and one of those worlds being the forces of modernity. And of course, we all are situated there, right? But I think it's really interesting in Bhutan the way it's institutionalized in the government. I would say that the central monastic body within Bhutan is part and parcel of the government. There's sort of two branches that sort of carry equal, if not sometimes overly privileged weight. And so interestingly, within guiding documents for the government, as well as the national environmental strategy, for example, local deities and spirits are referenced and known. There's a wide recognition. I mean, it's sort of, it's taken as an ontological given in Bhutan that the world is replete with intangible, more than human beings and spirits that reside in areas. And so I think what happens in the context of conservation and environment, as well as development, is that there are these introduced value systems where conservation globally, and I think, barring more recent decades, has sort of a fortress conservation mindset, has sort of neoliberal models and approaches to conservation. And these are upheld and taken as sort of the quintessential approach, right? If we're going to conserve these environments, we have to draw on these models. And so I think one thing that this research does, potentially, maybe, is it reminds us that there are living traditions in these places that already have, important relationships with the environment and the more than human actors that exist within them. And those are not to be ignored, right? Those are not to be banished to the past or to be models that are, considered backwards. And I know in Bhutan they're not, but I think that they're very infrequently privileged. And so I think one thing that that this project does is just sort of remind everyone of that fact, that there are existing, important ways in which the environment has been protected. And I'm not suggesting that it's born of the same ethic. It's not born of the same sort of conservation mindset that comes from more of a destructive society where, we need to preserve some of these places that are being eliminated. It's more to do with maintaining good relations, right? Because if you don't maintain good relations with local deities in your community, your family will fall ill, natural disasters will occur, and all sorts of and manners of unforeseen consequences. And so I just think Bhutan is a really interesting example of the complexities that are at play there. I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
So great job. I really enjoyed your presentation and your work overall. I think it's amazing. My question is about fermenters because I'm very interested about using community mapping. So you were saying about how these satellite images, there are 2D representations, and we are very used to look at them.
Right.
How was it to show them these communities have like images?
Yeah.
What was their reaction? Very curious.
Yeah, of course. So to repeat for the Zoom audience, Mariana asked, in the context of community mapping, participatory mapping, we in some ways are very used to this idea of sort of the bird's eye view, the orthographic view, the satellite view. How did the people who participated in our research, local community partners, how did they approach these maps that we introduced? And that was something that in the very early stages of my research, I was very uncertain about. I was uncertain whether or not this would even be a point for conversation, which is why I also tried to introduce sketch mapping protocols that allowed for more free-form ideas of landscape renderings. But what I found really interesting, and as you might expect within these community mapping exercises, that the ability to approach the map fell along different lines. They fell along generational lines, sometimes gendered lines, sometimes occupational lines. And so if there were young people who were visiting their family's home after going to college, they were very used to that view, right? And so oftentimes, sometimes within the participatory nature of those groups, they would sort of take the lead. And in some mapping workshops where there were no young people, it was really interesting when talking with elders in the community about these. Sometimes they looked at the map, but oftentimes, much more often, they either closed their eyes to look into their own mental map, or they sort of looked away from the map and gestured to the landscape, of course, where they were. And this is one of the reasons why I started to think differently about how these methodologies were inherently flawed. I was introducing this idea and this map view that was perceptible to some, and for others, it was difficult to approach, right? It was interesting, of course, when we started, one of the first tasks were to mark notable place names. So people would sort of, within the view, it's a satellite image. And so they were able to sort of look at landmarks from this bizarre angle and, comparatively bizarre, and find their house or find their village. And from there, they could sort of relationally think. And so that's why I suggested that the process of participatory mapping was sometimes more illuminating for me, not for them, of course. Maybe it would take some return visits to ask about that process. But that's why the process was much more interesting, because these cross-generational dialogues happen, these inter-occupational dialogues happen. People talked with each other about their shared conceptualization of, like, we know that the village deity Yula Agilanglep is there, but what's the extent of his territory? How far does it go? And differing sort of individual politics emerged where we defer to the elder in our group to say what the territory is, and so often it was not discrete, right? I think I especially in the very beginning came from this place where I thought we could trace the boundaries of deity territoriality. I brought tracing paper, I brought pens, and it immediately failed. I mean, this idea of trying to bound it in a polygon was ridiculous, right? And so that's when realizing that the idea of boundaries, the idea of sort of territory of these more than human beings was inherently relational. It was fluid. It depended on sort of being in the landscape, the phenomenology of living, and so I feel like this dissertation is much more of a reflection of like the flaws of my thinking than it is any sort of deep understanding of the cultural worlds that exist there.
One more question, because we are past 4 o'clock.
Look at the chat here, I'm not sure. Just starting to look at these. Like we have any questions. Are there any questions in Zoom land? It's so good to see all of your faces. George, it's so nice to see you as well. Thanks for being here. I think Shashir has a question. Go ahead, Shashir.
Hi, David. That was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed your presentation. I had a question about how Bhutanese people reconcile hydropower development, with their cosmology. And I had a very particular question. For example, if a hydropower dam comes up and submerges a few acres of land, and if there's a deity residing there, how do they change their worldview to that newly formed landscape which has been modified by the hydropower dam?
Yeah, it's a great question, Shashir, and thank you for asking that, because that's something that I wasn't able to go in depth in this presentation. But the hydropower development in Bhutan has been really interesting, and there are a lot of sort of geopolitical complexities there that I don't really have the time to address today. George would probably be able to address it better than I, but Yeah. So just to take an example, the Punat Sangchu hydropower dam is a mega dam. I mean, it's huge, and it's been in production for nearly a decade, under construction, and they continue to have problems with it. So there are landslides that are occurring. The geology is sort of shifting. I mean, comparatively, the Himalayas are relatively new geologies, right? And so the landscape, the earth, sloughs away very easily. And so one of the problems that Punat Sangchu hydropower has been having is that, you know, there are landslides, there are earthquakes that disrupt these areas. And so a lot of local community members have articulated that it's because you've angered the local deities in those areas by building, or that, you know, you improperly did the rituals, because of course they conducted rituals prior to even breaking ground many years ago. But what the central monastic body has done is build a really large chorten, which is sort of a religious edifice that is considered to have sort of anchoring powers for the intangible world. And so to subdue sort of otherwise unruly deities that are causing havoc for hydropower. And so they built this massive chorten that you drive past on your way down south to white-bellied heron territories. And I don't know if it's helped. I think there are a lot of other issues with hydropower, but that's just to say that people's relationships with hydropower is fairly contentious because it is very geopolitically sensitive. Most of the funding comes from India. All of the electricity is exported to India. And so, yeah, it's just complicated. People have sort of different relationships with it. My research, I wanted to better understand how local people perceived environmental changes in response to hydropower development as well as others, but it became really complicated because I would talk with people and there would be hidden transcripts, right? There would be people would tell me that, oh, there are no changes, but then they would go on to tell me that the fish, there are no longer large fish in the river systems where they used to go fishing. The water is more brown during the summer. We're having much more issues with like outbursts during the monsoon season. And so while they told me within our discussions that there are no changes, that they're not experiencing any impacts from hydropower, you know, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that's not true, but that there are just, it's very contentious and it's difficult to talk about. And so my research sort of took a pivot. I didn't necessarily want to put all of my eggs in this basket of sort of researching just sort of the relationship between people and hydropower, which is sort of what my research began as. And that's when I sort of expanded into just thinking more deeply about the intangible world of local deities and their impact in the conservation protected sites. Okay, thank you so much. I know it was a long talk, so thank you everyone for being here.
This. No.
Hey, David, can you stop your screen share?
Oh, thank you so much. Yes.
Good job, dude.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Julie. It was sort of hard to see whether or not I was still screen sharing or not. And I'm going to stop the recording now too.